At some point, certain people begin to notice something unsettling. They can no longer experience reality the same way everyone else seems to. Conversations start feeling scripted. Social rituals begin to look mechanical. Even happiness can feel strangely performative. And once you notice this, something irreversible happens. You can still participate in the world. You can still work, socialize, succeed. But internally, a quiet distance begins to form. Not because you believe you are better than others, but because you can suddenly see the machinery behind things that once felt natural. You notice how many people speak to preserve belonging rather than express truth. How often opinions are inherited instead of examined. How much of society runs on unconscious repetition. And the more clearly you see it, the harder it becomes to unsee it. This is the burden almost nobody talks about. The burden of intelligence is not knowing more. It is seeing too much. Schopenhauer understood this deeply. He believed intelligence was not simply a gift, but a form of exposure, a condition that strips away the comforting illusions most people unconsciously depend on. And once those illusions disappear, ordinary life never feels quite the same again. Schopenhauer believed that most people are not truly searching for truth. They are searching for comfort. Comfort in routine, comfort in belonging, comfort in repeating the same ideas everyone around them already accepts. And this is where intelligence quietly becomes painful. Because the moment a person begins valuing truth more than emotional comfort, reality starts changing shape. You begin noticing how many conversations are performances rather than communication. How many opinions are inherited instead of examined. How often people defend ideas, not because they are true, but because those ideas protect their identity. And once you see this clearly, something strange happens. You can still participate in the world, but you stop feeling fully immersed in it. Schopenhauer did not see pessimism as weakness. He saw it as lucidity, a painful awareness of how much human behavior is driven by fear, vanity, insecurity, and unconscious desire, rather than genuine understanding. And intelligent people often make one innocent mistake. They assume that if something is explained clearly enough, others will naturally want to understand it. But most people are not protecting truth. They are protecting psychological stability, which means that when intelligence exposes contradiction, illusion, or self-deception, it is rarely experienced as wisdom. It is experienced as discomfort. This is why highly perceptive people often feel socially out of place without fully understanding why. Not because they hate people, but because they begin sensing the invisible structures beneath ordinary interaction. The insecurity beneath confidence, the performance beneath charm, the hidden competition beneath politeness. And the room feels this perception even when nothing is said aloud, because intelligence is not always verbal. Sometimes it is simply a way of seeing that makes illusion nervous. Society claims to admire intelligence, but only a certain kind of intelligence. Intelligence that produces technology, intelligence that generates status, intelligence that entertains. But the moment intelligence becomes a mirror instead of a tool, everything changes, because people are comfortable with intelligence that serves the system. They become uncomfortable with intelligence that quietly reveals the system itself. And this creates a strange form of loneliness, a loneliness that is difficult to explain. You sit in conversations hearing two conversations at once, the words being spoken, and the emotional reality underneath them. You begin noticing how often people speak to maintain belonging rather than express what they truly think. How frequently entire groups organize themselves around avoidance. And this is exhausting, because most people are not constantly analyzing the atmosphere of a room, they are simply existing inside it. There is a kind of mercy in that, a softness in not examining everything too deeply. But highly perceptive people often lose that softness early, sometimes through disappointment, sometimes through betrayal, sometimes through isolation, sometimes simply because they started noticing too much too soon. And after that, reality becomes layered. Every belief has a hidden fear beneath it. Every social role starts feeling partially theatrical. Every system reveals its contradictions. A compliment can suddenly feel strategic. A friendship can feel conditional. And this is where many intelligent people begin withdrawing without realizing it. Not dramatically, quietly. They stop explaining themselves as much. They stop forcing connection. They stop expecting depth from every interaction. Because after enough disappointment, the mind begins conserving energy. And the strange thing is, people often misunderstand this withdrawal. They call it arrogance, coldness, detachment. But many times, it is exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly perceiving contradiction everywhere. And over time, this creates a dangerous temptation. The temptation to emotionally detach from humanity itself. Because seeing through illusion is not the same thing as transcending it. And many intelligent people slowly become trapped in observation instead of life itself. Analyzing everything, trusting very little, watching people carefully while secretly feeling unable to fully reach them. And this is the paradox. The more clearly they perceive human behavior, the more difficult genuine connection can become. Not because connection is impossible, but because perception removes innocence. At first, highly intelligent people usually believe their suffering comes from other people, from superficial conversations, from social conformity, from feeling misunderstood. But after a certain point, something more unsettling begins to emerge. They realize the real burden is not society itself. It is perception. Because once the mind becomes trained to detect patterns, contradictions, and hidden motives, it stops doing so selectively. It begins doing it constantly. And eventually perception becomes automatic. A person walks into a room and immediately senses the emotional hierarchy. Who needs approval? Who is masking insecurity with confidence? Who is performing intelligence rather than embodying it? None of this is consciously analyzed step by step. The mind simply sees it. And this is where intelligence slowly transforms from ability into exposure. Because the problem with seeing the machinery behind things is that the machinery never disappears again. A compliment no longer sounds entirely innocent. Success no longer looks entirely meaningful. Even identity itself begins to feel partially constructed. And for a while, this can create the illusion of superiority, the feeling that one has woken up, while others remain trapped inside unconscious patterns. But this is exactly where many intelligent people become trapped themselves, because perception without humility easily becomes alienation. Carl Jung warned about this in a different language. He understood that highly intellectual people often develop what he called inflation. The ego secretly identifies with its own awareness. It begins treating perception as proof of superiority rather than responsibility. And this creates a dangerous psychological split. Outwardly, the person appears insightful. Internally, they become emotionally disconnected from ordinary human experience. They observe life more than they participate in it. And at first, this feels powerful. There is comfort in detachment, comfort in standing outside the crowd, comfort in believing you are less unconscious than everyone else. But over time, something begins to decay, because human beings are not designed only to analyze reality. They are designed to live it. And many intelligent people slowly lose the ability to surrender to experience without dissecting it. Even joy becomes observed instead of felt. A beautiful moment happens, and part of the mind immediately steps outside the moment to interpret it. A relationship begins, and another layer of the mind starts mapping possible outcomes, hidden motives, future disappointments. Nothing remains immediate for very long. Everything becomes filtered through awareness. And this creates a subtle exhaustion that is difficult to explain to people who have never experienced it, because the intelligent mind is rarely fully resting. It is scanning, comparing, interpreting, connecting patterns, even in silence, especially in silence. This is one reason many highly perceptive people become deeply attached to solitude, not because they necessarily dislike humanity, but because solitude removes noise. It removes performance. For a brief moment, the mind no longer has to process endless social signals and emotional contradictions. And yet, solitude creates another paradox. Because the longer someone remains isolated inside observation, the more difficult ordinary connection becomes. Conversations begin feeling slower than thought itself. Social rituals start feeling repetitive. The individual slowly feels separated from life while still physically participating in it. And this is where many intelligent people make another mistake. They begin romanticizing detachment. They confuse emotional distance with wisdom. But wisdom and distance are not the same thing. A person can understand human behavior deeply and still remain disconnected from their own humanity. And this is the hidden danger of intelligence without integration. The mind becomes sharp, but the self becomes fragmented. This is why some brilliant people secretly envy ordinary people, not for their ignorance, but for their ability to remain immersed in life without constantly stepping outside of it. To laugh without analyzing the laughter. To love without dissecting the attachment. To exist without continuously observing themselves existing. And perhaps this is the real burden. Not that intelligent people think more, but that eventually they become unable to stop seeing. Highly intelligent people often believe loneliness comes from not being understood. But many times, the deeper problem is harder to explain. They no longer experience connection the same way they once did. Because perception changes intimacy. The more clearly someone sees human behavior, the harder it becomes to fully surrender to illusion. And all relationships require a certain amount of illusion. Not deception, illusion. The illusion that another person can completely understand you. The illusion that love can remove uncertainty. The illusion that emotional connection can remain untouched by fear, ego, contradiction, and change. Most people survive emotionally because they do not examine these illusions too closely. But highly analytical minds often do, and this creates tension inside relationships almost immediately. Part of the person wants closeness. Another part keeps observing everything from a distance. Watching tone changes, behavior shifts, small inconsistencies. The mind begins collecting patterns before trust has time to breathe, and eventually intimacy starts feeling less like surrender and more like analysis. This is why many intelligent people secretly struggle with emotional presence. Not because they lack feeling, often the opposite. They feel too much while simultaneously observing themselves feeling it. And this split becomes exhausting. A beautiful moment happens, and part of the mind immediately asks how long it will last. A deep connection forms, and another part starts anticipating loss before attachment has fully settled. Nothing stays simple for very long. Everything becomes layered with awareness. Because love requires vulnerability. Not intellectual vulnerability, emotional vulnerability. The willingness to enter uncertainty without controlling every possible outcome. But highly analytical people often confuse understanding with safety. They believe that if they think deeply enough, observe carefully enough, anticipate enough, they can somehow protect themselves from pain. But human connection does not work that way. In fact, excessive observation often weakens intimacy instead of protecting it, because the other person eventually feels the distance, the hesitation, the emotional caution, the subtle inability to fully arrive in the moment. And many intelligent people become trapped in this contradiction. They crave depth more than most people, yet struggle to stop analyzing the very thing they long for. This is one reason emotionally intelligent people are so rare. High perception alone is not enough. A person can understand psychology, philosophy, human behavior, even consciousness itself, while still remaining emotionally defended. And sometimes intelligence strengthens the defense, because intelligence can explain everything except surrender. It can explain attachment, explain trauma, explain emotional patterns. But explanation is not the same thing as participation. And eventually, the person notices something painful. They are watching life more than living it, watching relationships unfold while part of them remains psychologically outside the experience. And over time, this creates emotional fatigue, not dramatic heartbreak. Something quieter, the exhaustion of never fully relaxing into connection, always interpreting, always anticipating, always sensing the fragile nature of human attachment beneath the surface. This is why many intelligent people secretly envy those who can love more simply, not blindly. Simply, people who can still immerse themselves in experience without dissecting every emotional movement as it happens. Because once the mind becomes too identified with observation, innocence becomes difficult to recover. And innocence matters more than most intelligent people want to admit. Not childish innocence, existential innocence, the ability to remain emotionally present without needing complete certainty, to trust moments without immediately preparing for their ending, to love someone without constantly stepping outside the relationship to analyze its structure. But perception keeps interrupting immersion, and eventually the person begins feeling divided within themselves. One side deeply wants connection, the other side keeps scanning for contradiction and disappointment, and both sides slowly exhaust each other. This is why intelligence alone cannot resolve loneliness. Sometimes it intensifies it, because the mind becomes so skilled at detecting illusion that it accidentally begins filtering out spontaneity too. And without spontaneity, relationships slowly lose warmth. Everything becomes too conscious, too observed, too controlled. which is why some intelligent people eventually discover something humbling. The goal was never to understand connection perfectly. The goal was learning how to remain emotionally alive inside uncertainty. After a certain point, intelligent people stop fearing rejection. They start fearing meaninglessness. And this changes everything. Because once a person begins seeing through social performance, ordinary goals can lose their emotional gravity very quickly. Status begins feeling temporary. Validation starts feeling repetitive. Achievement no longer carries the weight it once promised. Externally, the person may still appear ambitious, functional, productive. But internally, something has already detached from the game. Not completely, just enough to make participation feel artificial. This is why many highly intelligent people secretly struggle with motivation. Not because they are lazy, but because they see too clearly how unstable most forms of external fulfillment really are. They notice how quickly excitement fades after success, how fragile identity becomes when built around recognition, how often ambition is simply the fear of insignificance wearing elegant clothing. And once these realizations accumulate, the person starts craving depth instead of stimulation. But modern society is not built for depth. It is built for distraction, constant movement, constant comparison, constant emotional consumption. And highly perceptive people often experience this world as overwhelming, not because they are weak, because they process too much at once. Every room carries emotional information. Every interaction carries hidden tension. Every social structure carries unspoken rules. And eventually the mind becomes tired from continuously translating reality beneath the surface. This is why many intelligent people disappear socially for long periods. Not always because they are depressed. Sometimes because they are trying to recover from overstimulation. And solitude begins feeling less like isolation and more like oxygen. For the first time all day, the nervous system can stop performing, stop scanning, stop adapting. But solitude has its own danger. If a person stays there too long, observation can replace participation completely. Life begins feeling distant, not painful in an obvious way, distant. The person watches the world instead of entering it, watches relationships instead of trusting them, watches emotion instead of surrendering to it. And over time, this can become numbness disguised as wisdom. This is why some highly intelligent people slowly lose their ability to feel wonder. Not because wonder disappears, because excessive analysis interrupts immersion. The mind explains the experience while the experience is still happening. A sunset becomes atmospheric physics. Romance becomes attachment dynamics. Human behavior becomes predictable psychological pattern. And, while all of this may be intellectually accurate, something essential begins disappearing. Mystery, not irrationality. Mystery, the capacity to remain open to life without immediately reducing it into explanation. And this is where intelligence can quietly turn against the person who carries it, because eventually the mind analyzes reality faster than the heart can live it. Everything becomes transparent too quickly. And transparency, when constant, becomes exhausting. This is one reason many intelligent people secretly admire children. Children remain inside experience. They have not yet separated themselves from life through endless observation. But analytical adults often experience existence from one step outside themselves. Always partially removed, always translating reality while it unfolds. And after years of this, something painful happens. The person starts feeling emotionally homeless, too aware to fully return to innocence, too human to completely detach from longing. So they remain suspended between perception and participation, wanting connection, distrusting connection, wanting meaning, seeing through the structures that normally create meaning. And eventually the person realizes the real burden was never intelligence itself. It was distance. Distance from spontaneity, distance from emotional surrender, distance from the unconscious flow most people still live inside naturally. And perhaps this is why intelligent people feel tired in ways they cannot explain. Not physically tired, existentially tired. Tired of constantly perceiving beneath appearances. Tired of translating reality into structure and pattern. Tired of carrying awareness into places where awareness itself becomes heavy. Because there comes a moment where perception stops feeling like power and starts feeling like exile. The most dangerous illusion intelligent people carry is the belief that awareness alone will save them. That if they can understand themselves deeply enough, understand people deeply enough, understand reality deeply enough, they will finally become untouchable. But life does not reward awareness the way the intellect hopes it will. In many cases, awareness simply makes vulnerability more visible. And this realization changes a person slowly. Because eventually, highly intelligent people discover something deeply frustrating. They can predict patterns, but they cannot control existence. They can detect contradiction, anticipate behavior, read emotional dynamics before they fully emerge. And still they remain vulnerable to loss, to grief, to betrayal, to uncertainty. And this creates a very specific form of exhaustion. The exhaustion of realizing that perception does not grant immunity. It only removes innocence. This is why many intelligent people secretly become obsessed with control. Not always externally, internally. They try to control emotion through understanding, control uncertainty through analysis, control pain through anticipation. The mind becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning reality for hidden instability. And after years of this, the nervous system forgets how to rest. Because rest requires trust. And trust becomes difficult once perception becomes too sharp. The person begins seeing how fragile everything actually is. Relationships change, people change, identity changes, meaning itself changes. Nothing stays fixed long enough for the analytical mind to fully relax inside it. And eventually life starts feeling psychologically unsafe. Not because danger is everywhere, because impermanence is everywhere. Most people survive this reality unconsciously. They distract themselves from it, stay busy enough not to look directly at it. But highly perceptive people often cannot fully look away. And this creates another hidden burden of intelligence, the inability to remain emotionally asleep. The person notices mortality in ordinary moments, notices loneliness inside crowded places, notices fear beneath confidence, and after enough years they begin carrying a kind of silent grief that is difficult to explain. Not grief for one event, grief for existence itself. The grief of realizing how temporary everything is, how unstable human identity really becomes under pressure, how quickly certainty collapses when life turns unexpectedly. And this is why many intelligent people quietly lose interest in superficial success over time. Not because success is meaningless, but because they begin seeing how little external achievement protects a person from inner emptiness. Someone can become admired and still feel disconnected from themselves, respected and still lonely, powerful and still terrified. And once you truly see this, ambition changes. The person no longer wants to impress the world as much. They want relief from fragmentation, relief from the endless internal division between perception and participation. Because eventually the intelligent mind becomes tired of observing everything from a distance. It wants to return to life again, not to ignorance, to presence. And this becomes the real challenge, not becoming more intelligent, learning how to remain human without abandoning awareness, because intelligence alone cannot heal isolation. In fact, intelligence often intensifies it, especially when perception becomes separated from emotional integration. This is why some highly intelligent people slowly become emotionally cold. Not because they were born cold, because disappointment taught them to mistrust openness, taught them that emotional investment creates vulnerability. So they retreat deeper into observation, deeper into analysis, deeper into self-protection disguised as wisdom. But eventually, something inside them begins resisting this strategy. Because human beings cannot survive on perception alone, the soul becomes starved without participation, without intimacy, without emotional risk, without moments of surrender. And this is the paradox intelligence eventually discovers. The mind wants certainty. Life demands vulnerability. The mind wants control. Love requires exposure. The mind wants complete understanding before trust. But existence never offers those guarantees honestly. So the intelligent person reaches a crossroads. Continue living entirely through observation. Or accept the terrifying reality that being fully alive requires uncertainty, requires emotional risk, requires stepping into experience without fully mastering it first. And for many intelligent people, this becomes the hardest lesson of all. Not learning how to think more deeply, learning how to stop hiding behind thought itself. Because eventually the greatest prison is not ignorance. It is awareness without surrender. Modern culture offers intelligent people a very seductive lie. It tells them they are special, different, rare, more aware than everyone else around them. And at first, this feels comforting. Finally, there seems to be an explanation for the distance they have carried their entire lives. The exhaustion, the isolation, the feeling of never fully belonging anywhere. So they begin identifying with the role of the outsider, the observer, the one who sees more deeply than others. But this identity slowly becomes dangerous because the ego loves turning pain into superiority. And many intelligent people unconsciously begin protecting their loneliness instead of healing it. They stop relating to people naturally. Instead, they categorize them: asleep, superficial, predictable, unaware. And this creates an invisible wall between themselves and humanity. Not because they truly hate people, because distance begins feeling safer than disappointment. And the frightening part is how socially rewarded this mindset has become. Modern culture constantly romanticizes alienation, the misunderstood genius, the emotionally detached intellectual, the person who sees through everything. But very few people talk about the psychological cost of living this way for too long. Because eventually detachment stops feeling intelligent. It starts feeling empty. A person cannot spend years emotionally separating themselves from humanity without consequences. At some point, the nervous system begins craving warmth again, real warmth, not stimulation, not validation, not superiority, connection. And this is the painful contradiction many intelligent people eventually face. They spent years protecting themselves from disappointment through observation, only to discover that observation cannot replace intimacy. It cannot replace emotional presence. And this is where many people watching this video may quietly recognize themselves, not in the intelligence, in the exhaustion of always analyzing, always perceiving, always standing slightly outside the moment instead of fully inside it. If you are still here with me at the end of this video, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow us every day. Because some conversations cannot happen inside ordinary noise, and maybe that is why you stayed this long. Not to feel superior to other people, but to finally hear an experience you could never fully explain, put into words. And there is one final part of this burden that almost nobody talks about, because eventually intelligent people realize something deeply humbling. The problem was never that humanity was unconscious. The problem was believing consciousness alone could save them from suffering. Awareness can reveal illusion, but it cannot replace participation. It cannot love for you, cannot trust for you, cannot surrender for you. And eventually, life forces every intelligent person to confront the same terrifying truth. No amount of perception removes the risk of being human. You still lose people, still feel uncertainty, still experience grief, still need connection. And this realization changes everything, because true maturity begins the moment intelligence stops being used as emotional armor. The moment awareness becomes softer instead of colder. The moment perception no longer exists to separate you from humanity, but to reconnect you to it with honesty. Not naive honesty, conscious honesty, the kind that sees contradiction clearly while still remaining open to life. And perhaps this is the real task. Not becoming less aware. Learning how to carry awareness without allowing it to turn into isolation. Because intelligence without warmth eventually becomes sterile. And perception without humanity eventually becomes loneliness, disguised as wisdom. Perhaps the real burden of intelligence was never thinking more deeply than other people. Perhaps it was losing the ability to remain unconscious inside ordinary life. Because after years of observing reality too closely, many intelligent people eventually discover something unexpected. The mind can explain life endlessly and still remain unable to fully live it. It can understand attachment while still fearing intimacy, understand human behavior while still feeling alone, understand suffering while still being wounded by it. And this realization humbles a person, because eventually, intelligence reaches its limit. There comes a moment where analysis can no longer protect you from existence itself. No philosophy removes grief completely. No awareness removes uncertainty. No perception removes vulnerability. And this is where something important begins changing. The intelligent person slowly stops asking, "How do I escape suffering?" and starts asking, "How do I remain open to life without becoming destroyed by it?" That is a very different question. A quieter question. A more human question. Because the truth is, many intelligent people spend years unconsciously trying to transcend ordinary humanity, trying to rise above emotion, above disappointment, above confusion. But life has a strange way of dissolving those illusions eventually. Not cruelly, honestly. It reminds every person, no matter how perceptive they are, that being conscious does not make someone separate from humanity. It makes them responsible for how they carry their humanity. And perhaps this is the real turning point. The moment awareness stops becoming a wall and starts becoming compassion. Not naive compassion, conscious compassion. The kind that sees contradiction clearly, but no longer needs to stand above it. The kind that understands human weakness because it has finally accepted its own. Because in the end, intelligent people are not exhausted simply because they think deeply. They are exhausted because they spent too many years trying to survive through observation alone. Watching life instead of entering it fully, protecting themselves through distance, trying to outthink pain instead of learning how to metabolize it. But eventually, something inside the person begins longing for return to presence, return to warmth, return to simple human moments untouched by endless analysis. And strangely enough, this is where wisdom may actually begin. Not in superiority, not in detachment, not in seeing through everyone else, but in learning how to remain psychologically open after seeing how fragile everything truly is. Because there is courage in perception, but there is even greater courage in tenderness, greater courage in trust, greater courage in allowing yourself to participate in life again after becoming aware of its uncertainty. And maybe that is the final paradox intelligence discovers, that peace was never found through mastering reality completely. Peace begins the moment a person stops demanding certainty before allowing themselves to live. The moment they stop treating awareness like armor. The moment they understand that vulnerability was never proof of weakness. It was proof of participation. So perhaps the burden of intelligence is not that some people see too much. Perhaps the burden is learning how to keep the heart alive after the illusions disappear. If this video resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and share it with 5 people who may have quietly carried this same feeling for years. And leave a sincere comment below. Not the intelligent answer, the honest one. What part of being aware has been the hardest for you to carry? And what subject should we explore next? Because some conversations begin exactly where performance ends. And maybe that is where real thought begins too.